The sharp, rhythmic clang of a hammer hitting a cold steel spike echoes through a cavernous brick hall. It is 1890, and the air in Deptford, South London, is thick with the scent of hot oil, sea salt from the Thames, and a sharp metallic tang of ozone that no one yet has a word for. A young man named Harold Cole stands before a thick copper cord cable. He is not wearing protective gear. He is wearing a frock coat and a bowler hat. He raises a heavy sledgehammer. With a grunt of effort, he drives a steel chisel directly through the center of a live 10,000-volt main. A blinding flash should have vaporized him. The crowd of skeptical engineers and investors holds its breath. But there is no explosion. The safety fuse blows silently in the distance, and Cole remains standing, a grin spreading across his face. This was the moment the world's electrical future was decided, not in a laboratory in Menlo Park, but on a muddy bank of the Thames. Today, if you walk down to the Stowage in Deptford, London, SE8, you will find yourself surrounded by the glass and steel sheen of luxury apartment complexes and the quiet, sterile atmosphere of a gentrified riverside. The towering chimneys are gone, the massive, soot-stained brick cathedrals of industry that once vibrated with the power of 200,000 light bulbs have been razed. Where the world's first true high-voltage power station once stood, a structure that was, at its birth, the largest building in the British Empire, there is now only a small, weathered plaque, and the sound of the tide hitting the embankment. The industry that Ferranti built has become so fundamental to our existence that it has rendered him invisible. We live in the grid he designed, yet his name has been scrubbed from the collective memory, overshadowed by the marketing genius of Edison and the tragic mystique of Tesla. The great paradox of Sebastian de Ferranti is that he succeeded too well. He solved the problem of the death current so completely that we stopped fearing it, and in doing so, we stopped marveling at it. In the 1880s, the Battle of the Currents was not just a commercial war. It was a philosophical struggle over the very nature of the city. The prevailing wisdom, backed by the immense wealth of Thomas Edison, was that electricity should be generated locally, small, low-voltage basements feeding a few nearby streets. Ferranti looked at the cramped, smog-choked streets of London and saw a different future, a centralized temple of power located far from the consumers, transmitting energy at voltages that contemporaries considered suicidal. The London of 1887 was a city of transitions. The Victorian era was at its zenith, yet the very foundations of its light were failing. Gaslight was the undisputed king, but it was a filthy, oxygen-consuming monarch. In the grand theaters of the West End, the heat from gas chandeliers was so intense that audiences frequently fainted, and the soot blackened the intricate plasterwork of the ceilings within weeks. The Grosvenor Gallery in Bond Street, an elite hub for the aesthetic movement, decided to rebel. They installed a small generator to light their paintings without the damaging fumes of gas, but the neighbors complained of the vibration, and the machines were unreliable. They needed a genius. They found a 24-year-old Sebastian de Ferranti, a man of Italian-British descent who had already patented an alternator at the age of 18. Ferranti did not just fix the Grosvenor Gallery. He reimagined the scale of human ambition. He looked at the tiny, flickering lights of Bond Street and envisioned a web that would drape across the entire metropolis. At the time, the Electric Lighting Act of 1882 had effectively strangled the British electrical industry. The law dictated that local authorities could buy out any private electric company after just 21 years at the scrap value of the equipment. This made long-term investment impossible for everyone, except Ferranti. He convinced the London Electric Supply Corporation that the only way to bypass these restrictions was to build a station so massive, so far away, and so efficient that no one could compete. The aesthetic of the early Ferranti era was one of Gothic industrialism. Imagine a workspace where the tools of the trade are not delicate microchips, but massive castings of iron and coils of copper as thick as a man's thigh. The Deptford station was designed to be a pioneer station. Ferranti moved his operations to a 5-acre site on the Thames, a location that allowed for the easy delivery of coal by barge and an unlimited supply of cooling water. This was the birth of the industrial powerhouse. While Edison was building central stations that could barely reach half a mile, Ferranti was planning to send 10,000 volts over 7 miles of cable. To his peers, 10,000 volts was not a technical specification, it was a death sentence. The highest voltage in use at the time was barely 2,000 volts, and insulation technology was practically non-existent. Ferranti's response was not to retreat, but to invent. He realized that the rubber and gutta-percha insulation used for telegraph cables would melt under the heat of his proposed current, so he designed his own. The Ferranti trunk main was a masterpiece of Victorian lateral thinking. It consisted of 2 concentric copper tubes separated by layers of brown paper soaked in ozokerite wax. This 20-foot-long electric sausage was the first high-voltage underground cable in history. It was rigid, heavy, and required a specialized team of workmen to join the segments with precision that bordered on the surgical. Each joint was a potential point of failure that could result in a catastrophic arc flash. Yet, Ferranti personally supervised the laying of these mains through the heart of London, often working in the trenches alongside his men, his face smeared with wax and soot, a figure of relentless, aristocratic energy in the middle of a chaotic construction site. Chapter: The Architecture of an Impossible Current. By the spring of 1889, the Deptford site was no longer a mudflat, it was a fortress of energy. The scale of the machinery being installed was so unprecedented that it required the creation of entirely new manufacturing techniques. Sebastian de Ferranti was not merely an engineer, he was an industrial dictator. He personally designed every component, from the massive boilers to the smallest porcelain insulators. At the heart of the A station were the Ferranti alternators, mechanical gods of iron and copper. The first 2 units were driven by 1,250 horsepower vertical engines built by Hick, Hargreaves and Company of Bolton. Each of these engines stood 3 stories high, their massive pistons churning with a rhythmic thunder that could be felt in the soles of your boots half a mile away. But these were merely the small prototypes. Ferranti's ultimate plan involved the installation of 4 colossal 10,000 horsepower engines. To put this in perspective, the largest marine engines in the world's most powerful battleships at the time barely topped 5,000 horsepower. Ferranti was planning to double that capacity for a civilian utility. The flywheels for these monsters were designed to be 45 feet in diameter, weighing nearly 500 tons. The sheer centrifugal force generated by such a mass spinning at high speeds was terrifying. If a flywheel were to shatter, it would have leveled the entire neighborhood like a naval bombardment. The technical black magic of Deptford lay in the armature. Most contemporary generators used heavy, wire-wound cores that became dangerously hot due to eddy currents. Ferranti's zigzag armature was different. It used thin strips of copper tape insulated with vulcanized fiber, allowing for massive current density without the meltdown risks. This was the Ferranti patent, and it was the reason he could achieve 10,000 volts while his rivals struggled with 2,000 volts. Yet, the machines were only half the battle. The true war was fought in the ground. The London Electric Supply Corporation, LESCO, had reached a breaking point. No manufacturer in the world, not Siemens in Germany, nor the telegraph companies in Greenwich, would guarantee a cable that could carry 10,000 volts. They claimed it was physically impossible to contain that much electrical pressure underground. Ferranti's response was characteristically blunt. If no one will make it, I will make it myself. He converted a portion of the Deptford works into a specialized cable factory. This was the birth of the Ferranti concentric main. The process was a marvel of Victorian material science. A central copper tube was wrapped in 20 layers of high-quality brown paper, the kind used for grocery bags. This paper was then vacuum-dried and saturated in boiling ozokerite, a natural mineral wax imported from Eastern Europe. A second copper tube was slid over the paper-wrapped core, and the entire assembly was protected by an outer iron pipe. It was, effectively, a rigid, 20-foot-long high-voltage straw. Because the cables were rigid, they couldn't be wound onto drums. They had to be transported on flatbed wagons and joined together every 20 feet. The Ferranti joint became the stuff of engineering legend. It involved a tapered male and female end, driven together with hydraulic jacks and insulated with more wax and paper. There were over 7,000 of these joints between Deptford and the West End. Each one was a potential bomb. If a single bubble of air remained in the wax, or if a microscopic piece of grit entered the joint, the 10,000-volt current would find it, carbonize the insulation, and create a subterranean explosion. Critics called it a suicide pact with the city. The financial stakes were equally staggering. By 1890, the LesCo had poured over £800,000 into the project, roughly £110 million in today's currency. Ferranti, still only 26 years old, was managing a budget that would have intimidated a seasoned government minister. He was being paid a salary of £800 a year, plus a 5% royalty on his patents, making him one of the highest-paid young men in the empire. But his position was precarious. He was surrounded by the board, men of finance who understood dividends but had no concept of the Ferranti effect. The Ferranti effect was a phenomenon Sebastian discovered during the initial testing phases. He noticed that when the long underground cables were energized but not yet carrying a load, no lights turned on, the voltage at the far end of the line actually increased. The 10,000 volts leaving Deptford would arrive in Bond Street as 11,000 volts or more. This was the result of the cable acting as a massive capacitor, a concept so new that even the era's leading physicists, like Lord Kelvin, struggled to explain it. Ferranti, however, didn't wait for the physicists. He simply redesigned his transformers to compensate. He was building the future in real time, often correcting the laws of physics as they manifested in his machinery. The breakthrough moment came in late 1890. While Edison's agents in New York were busy electrocuting stray animals to prove that AC was the executioner's current, Ferranti began pumping 10,000 volts from the mud of Deptford into the heart of London. He didn't just light a gallery, he lit the empire. The reliability of the Deptford mains was so high compared to the local DC generators that theaters and hotels began switching en masse. For a brief, shining moment, it looked as though Ferranti had won. But then, on the night of November 15th, 1890, the nightmare began. At the Grosvenor substation, an arc-over occurred during a routine switching operation. A massive fire erupted, fueled by the variozocherite wax that insulated the cables. The death current was finally living up to its name, and the skeptics were ready to pounce. The zenith of the electric king. The fire at the Grosvenor substation on that cold November night in 1890 was not just a technical failure. It was a PR nightmare that nearly strangled the future of the British power grid in its crib. As flames licked the ceiling and the smell of burning ozocherite filled the air, the city's elite, who had only just begun to trust this invisible force, suddenly saw it as a demonic entity. For 3 months, the electric light went dark across London's most expensive real estate. Yet, it is in this moment of crisis that the character of Sebastian de Ferranti truly shines. While the board of directors panicked and the newspapers screamed about the Deptford danger, Ferranti was already redesigning the switchgear. He didn't just replace what had burned. He invented the first high-voltage oil brake switch, a device that quenched arcs in a bath of insulating oil, a technology that remains a standard in power distribution to this day. By 1891, Deptford had risen from the ashes and entered its golden era. It was, quite literally, the eighth wonder of the engineering world. Visitors from across the globe, including a young Guglielmo Marconi and delegations from the Japanese Empire, made the pilgrimage to the banks of the Thames to witness the Ferranti gods in action. The scale was intoxicating. The great 1,250 horsepower alternators were now running smoothly, feeding a network that stretched from the docks of Deptford to the mansions of Belgravia. Ferranti himself was a Victorian superstar. He moved in circles that included the likes of Lord Kelvin and Sir William Crookes. He wasn't just a technician. He was a philosopher of the electron. In an 1891 lecture to the Institution of Electrical Engineers, He proposed a national grid, a concept that would not be realized in Britain for another 40 years. He predicted that electricity would become so cheap that it would be a crime to burn coal in a private grate, envisioning a smokeless, gleaming London powered by massive, remote stations. The anecdotes from this period paint a picture of a man who lived a century ahead of his time. When a prestigious client complained that the new AC motors were humming too loudly, Ferranti didn't apologize. He invited them to the station and explained that they were hearing the song of the future. He was also a man of immense physical courage. On several occasions, when a connection failed in the middle of the night, Ferranti would climb the high-tension galleries himself, his hands inches away from conductors carrying enough energy to vaporize a horse, calmly adjusting the contacts while his assistants watched in paralyzed terror. However, the very ambition that made Deptford possible was beginning to create its own gravity. The 10,000 horsepower plan was where the friction between visionary genius and Victorian finance became terminal. To build these massive engines, Ferranti needed more capital, but the board of the London Electric Supply Corporation was growing weary of his constant innovations. They wanted dividends, not revolutionary breakthroughs. The cost of the Deptford project had ballooned to nearly £1 million. In an era where a skilled laborer earned £80 a year, the expenditure was incomprehensible to the average shareholder. The turning point came with the scaling back. In a move that mirrors the short-sightedness of modern venture capital, the board decided to cancel the two largest 10,000 horsepower engines that were mid-construction. They viewed them as too risky and too large for current demand. It was a classic failure of imagination. They were trying to apply 19th century bookkeeping to a 20th century technology. Ferranti was furious. He argued that the efficiency gained by the larger scale would pay for itself in 5 years. The board disagreed. In August 1891, after a series of heated meetings at the Lesco headquarters, the man who had built the world's first superstation was effectively forced out of his own creation. He was 27 years old. This moment echoes through industrial history like a recurring ghost. We see it in the way Xerox PARC developed the modern computer interface, only for the company to ignore it, or how early pioneers of the internet were sidelined by those who saw only the immediate bottom line. Ferranti's departure marked the beginning of a shift from heroic engineering to corporate utility management. The Deptford station continued to run, but the soul of the project had been lobotomized. The massive foundations intended for the 10,000 horsepower engines were left empty. Giant brick-lined pits that served as a monument to what could have been. As the 1890s progressed, the market began to consolidate. Ferranti had proven that high-voltage AC was the only way to power a modern city, but he would not be the one to profit from its total victory. In America, Westinghouse and Tesla were taking his Deptford model and scaling it at Niagara Falls with the backing of J.P. Morgan. In Britain, a patchwork of smaller, less efficient stations began to pop up, ignoring Ferranti's centralized vision in favor of local, short-term profits. This fragmentation would plague the British electrical industry for decades, resulting in a chaotic mess of different voltages and frequencies that wasn't standardized until the late 1920s. Ferranti had given them the blueprint for the future, but the world was too busy counting its pennies to read the fine print. The golden age of Deptford ended not with a bang, but with a ledger. The station remained the most powerful in the world for a few more years, but the momentum had shifted. The era of the individual inventor titan was being replaced by the era of the committee. Sebastian moved on to found Ferranti Limited, focusing on meters and smaller components, but he would never again be given the keys to a project of Deptford's magnitude. He had flown too close to the sun, and the wax on his wings, or in this case, the ozokerite in his cables, had begun to melt under the heat of corporate reality. By the turn of the century, the pioneering spirit of Deptford began to collide with the cold, hard reality of the Second Industrial Revolution. Sebastian de Ferranti's giant reciprocating engines, those thundering gods of iron that he had fought so hard to build, were suddenly becoming beautiful anachronisms. In 1884, Charles Parsons had invented the steam turbine, a machine that was smaller, smoother, and vastly more efficient than Ferranti's massive pistons. It was a bitter irony. The man who had envisioned the future was being overtaken by a technology he hadn't pioneered. In 1901, the A station at Deptford began the slow process of being retrofitted, its grand Ferranti alternators replaced by the hum of turbines. The cathedral was being turned into a factory. Sebastian himself did not fade away, though his influence on the Deptford site did. He moved north to Hollinwood, near Manchester, and founded Ferranti Limited. There, he transformed his name into a brand that would dominate British electrical engineering for a century. He turned his attention to the mundane but essential, the electricity meter. If the world was going to use his grid, it needed a way to pay for it. The Ferranti meter became the silent auditor in millions of British homes, a small black box that hummed with the same alternating current he had nearly died to defend. Yet, as the company grew into a titan of electronics, radar, and eventually computing, producing the Ferranti Mark I, the world's first commercially available general-purpose computer, the story of where it all began started to erode. The Deptford station itself lived a long, tiered life. The original A station, the brick marvel of 1887, was finally decommissioned and demolished in the 1930s to make way for Deptford West and Deptford East, massive, brutalist successors that dominated the skyline. For decades, the two giant chimneys of Deptford remained the tallest structures on the Thames, landmarks for sailors, and symbols of London's industrial lung. But the end was inevitable. In 1983, the fires were finally extinguished. The age of coal on the Thames was over. In 1991, the final chimneys were brought down in a controlled demolition that lasted only seconds, turning a century of electrical history into a cloud of red brick dust. Today, if you visit the site at the Stowage, SE8, the silence is absolute. The ground where the 10,000 horsepower foundations once sat is now buried under the manicured lawns and gravel paths of luxury riverside apartments. The name Ferranti is almost nowhere to be found. There are no statues here. To find his physical legacy, you have to go to the Science Museum in South Kensington, where a single, massive segment of his 10,000-volt copper and paper cable sits in a glass case. It looks like a relic from an alien civilization, a piece of industrial jewelry that changed the world, yet most visitors walk past it without a second glance. The disappearance of the Deptford legacy is a mirror to our own relationship with technology. We treat the power grid as a natural phenomenon, like the weather or the tides, forgetting that it was willed into existence by a 24-year-old man who was told he was insane. We live in an era of disruption, where tech founders are treated as prophets, yet we have forgotten the ultimate disruptor, the man who looked at a gaslit world and decided to rewire the very fabric of reality. The industry Ferranti created became so successful that it became invisible. We only notice it when it fails, when the lights flicker and the silence of 1880 returns for a brief, terrifying moment. Sebastian de Ferranti died in January 1930. He lived just long enough to see the first towers of the national grid, the very system he had predicted in 1891, rising across the British countryside. He didn't die a broken man, he died a wealthy and respected one, but he died knowing that his greatest creation, the Deptford dream, had been absorbed into the collective machine of the state. He had given the world fire, and in return, the world had turned him into a utility. The story of Deptford is not just a story of cables and coal. It is a testament to the fact that the most profound changes in human history are often the ones we stop seeing the moment they work. We walk over his ghost every time we step onto a London street, and we breathe his ambition every time we flip a switch in the dark. He did not just build a power station, he built the nervous system of the modern world. He found a city in the flickering shadows of the past and left it vibrating with the invisible pulse of the future.